Hello friends, and welcome back to Farmyard Care. If you have ever stood in the yard watching a load of hay arrive and felt that little jolt in your chest before the bales even touch the ground, then you already know this story. You stack it, you cover it, you hope the weather stays on your side, and somehow, before long, you are right back in the same place again, paying more than you wanted and wondering how long this cycle can keep going. And this is exactly why so many small farmers, homesteaders, backyard growers, and families trying to raise animals on their own land feel worn down. You are not lazy. You are not doing it wrong. You are simply trying to make good feed stretch further, protect your animals through dry months and cold seasons, and build a setup that does not depend on spending more money every single year just to stay in place. So let me ask you something honestly. Have we accepted a system that was never truly designed to give small landowners peace of mind? What if the stress of drought, rising feed prices, and half-empty storage spaces does not have to be a permanent part of keeping livestock? What if one of the biggest mistakes in modern farming is that we forgot how older generations built feed systems that kept working season after season? Because there was a time when farmers did not treat replanting and rebuying as the only answer. They planted once, established the right forage in the right place, and let the land keep producing. Deep roots did the work, perennial growth did the work, and animals had access to living feed without depending so heavily on barns full of dry hay that lost value with time. So in today's video, we are going to look at a completely different way of thinking about fodder. We are going to talk about deep-rooted perennial plants that can help you feed your herd through changing seasons, cut pressure on your hay bill, and turn your land into something more reliable, more productive, and far more resilient in the long run. If that sounds like the kind of practical, ground-level knowledge you have been looking for, make sure you subscribe to Farmyard Care. And let's get into the system that could change the way you feed your animals from the ground up. Part 1. The broken system of traditional hay. Before we talk about the perennial plants that can change a feeding system from the ground up, we need to be honest about the system most small farmers have been pushed into. On the surface, storing hay looks practical, familiar, even responsible. But for many homesteads and family farms, it has quietly become one of the most exhausting and expensive parts of raising livestock. Every year, as the seasons begin to shift, that pressure starts building. Hay prices creep up, storage areas fill fast, and families start running numbers that never seem to come out in their favor. And the hard truth is this: relying mainly on baled hay is not some timeless tradition handed down in perfect form. In many ways, it is a modern dependency, and for small operations, it comes with 3 serious weaknesses. The first is weather. The moment drought hits, the whole system becomes unstable. Yields drop, prices rise, and suddenly one dry season can push a small farmer dangerously close to selling animals they worked years to build up. The second problem is storage. Hay only works if you can keep it dry, protected, and properly ventilated. That means barns, tarps, space, labor, and constant attention. If moisture gets into it, mold follows. And once hay starts molding, it stops being a solution and starts becoming a risk to animal health. But the third problem is the one most people do not think about enough. Stored hay does not stay the same. The longer it sits, the more nutritional quality it loses. Proteins decline, valuable nutrients fade. So what looks like security in autumn can become far less nourishing by the heart of winter. Your animals may still be eating, their stomachs may still look full, but the feed in front of them is no longer giving the same support it did when it was first cut. And that is the question more people need to ask. Why do we keep pouring so much time, labor, fuel, and money into a system that weakens as it sits? Why do we work through the hottest months to store feed that slowly degrades while we depend on it? Because the truth is, older farming systems often leaned on living forage, not just dead storage. And once you understand that, it becomes much easier to imagine a better path forward. Part 2. The paradigm shift. Meet the living haystacks. Now here is where things start to get exciting. Imagine stepping outside in late summer, when the pasture is tired and the ground is dry, or in the colder part of the year when feed becomes a daily worry. Instead of cutting open another expensive bale, you open a gate and walk your animals toward a standing reserve of green, living feed. Not feed you planted again this year, not feed you had to dry and stack. Feed that is still alive, still rooted, and still producing. That is the idea behind the living haystack. What we are talking about here is a shift away from shallow-rooted annual forage systems and toward deep-rooted perennial fodder plants, especially shrubs and small trees that can keep producing useful feed year after year. These plants do not need to be replanted every season. Their roots reach far deeper into the soil than most pasture grasses ever can, pulling up moisture and nutrients even when the surface looks tired, dry, or completely spent. That changes everything. When ordinary pasture begins to fade under drought or heat stress, these perennial systems can keep going. While shallow-rooted grasses dry out and lose value, woody fodder plants continue drawing from deeper reserves below the ground, turning that hidden water and fertility into green feed right where your animals need it. That is why this approach is not just about saving money on hay, it is about breaking the connection between livestock survival and short-term weather swings. And in today's video, we are going to look at 3 of the strongest examples of this system in action. Depending on your climate, your soil, and the kind of animals you raise, one of these may become the plant that changes your farm for good. Napier grass, Tagasaste, and Leucaena. Part 3. Napier grass, the cut and carry champion. Let's begin with a plant that has earned the respect of countless farmers in warm regions. Napier grass, often called elephant grass because of how fast, thick, and tall it can grow. If you live in a warm climate, this is one of those plants that can keep producing with surprisingly little fuss once it is established. And that is exactly why so many growers see it as one of the most practical ways to build a dependable fodder supply close to home. What makes Napier especially attractive is how simple the setup can be. You are not forced into buying expensive seed year after year. In most cases, you start it from stem cuttings. A section of stalk with a few healthy nodes goes into the soil, and from that single planting, you can build a root system that keeps sending up fresh growth again and again for many years. For a small farm or homestead, that kind of return from one planting is hard to ignore. But there is a key lesson here that many beginners miss. With Napier, more height does not always mean better feed. A lot of people let it shoot up as tall as possible because they are chasing volume. On paper, that seems smart. In practice, it often gives you tougher stems, woodier growth, and lower feed quality. The real trick is to cut it earlier while the plant is still tender and leafy. When you harvest it around 3 to 4 feet tall, you are usually catching it at a stage where the nutrition is far more useful to your animals. And if you really want to make this system work harder for you, pair it with Desmodium, a low-growing legume that fits beautifully into the same space. Desmodium helps fix nitrogen and supports the soil around the Napier roots, which means stronger growth, better feed value, and less dependence on outside inputs. That is the kind of partnership good farmers always look for, one plant feeding the animals and the other helping feed the system itself. Part 4. Tagasaste, tree lucerne, the desert survivor. Now, if your land is lighter, poorer, sandier, or more exposed to dry summers and cold spells, then Napier may not be your answer. This is where Tagasaste, also known as tree lucerne, enters the conversation. And for the right farm, it can be a remarkable plant. Tagasaste is native to the Canary Islands, and it behaves like a plant that was designed for hard places. While ordinary pasture grasses live close to the surface and suffer quickly when conditions turn harsh, Tagasaste goes looking for what it needs deep below. Its taproot can drive far down into the soil, reaching moisture reserves that shallow-rooted plants never touch. That is why even when nearby pasture has gone brown and lifeless, Tagasaste can still be standing there green, leafy, and ready to feed. That alone would make it valuable. But the real strength of this plant is that it offers more than survival. It offers quality. The leaves are rich, highly usable, and capable of supporting cattle, sheep, and even poultry when managed properly. So instead of looking out across dry land and seeing a feed shortage, you are looking at a living source of forage that keeps working when ordinary systems begin to fail. Of course, a plant this useful needs to be managed with some care. Sheep in particular can be hard on Tagasaste. They do not just nibble the leaves. If left too long, they may strip bark and damage the plant badly. That is why rotational grazing matters so much here. Let animals in for a controlled period, let them browse hard but briefly, and then move them out before they start destroying the structure that makes the plant productive in the first place. And there is one more reason Tagasaste deserves attention. In late winter, when many landscapes still feel empty and dormant, it produces masses of pale flowers that offer an important food source for pollinators and birds. So you are not only planting feed for your herd, you are strengthening the wider life of the farm as well. And that is exactly what makes a perennial fodder system so powerful. It does not just solve one problem, it improves the whole environment around it. Part 6. The Silvopasture Revolution. More than just feed. And once you begin to see the value of plants like Napier, Tagasaste, and Leucaena, another truth becomes impossible to ignore. You are not just planting feed. You are reshaping the whole environment your animals live in. That is where this conversation expands into something much bigger: silvopasture. Silvopasture is the practice of growing trees, forage, and livestock together on the same land in a deliberate, working system. And when it is done well, the benefits go far beyond what ends up in the feed trough. Start with the animals themselves. In the heat of summer, open pasture can be punishing. Cattle burn energy simply trying to stay cool. They eat less comfortably, rest poorly, and carry that stress through the entire season. But in a silvopasture system, the presence of trees changes the conditions dramatically. Shade softens the heat, lowers stress, and helps animals hold condition more efficiently. Then in the colder months, those same trees become windbreaks, giving calves, lambs, and adult stock far more protection from harsh exposure. But the real power of this system also lies below ground. Deep-rooted perennial legumes such as Tagasaste and Leucaena do more than feed animals. They help restore fertility. They draw nitrogen into the system, support the grasses growing around them, and improve the living structure of the soil itself. Their roots reach into layers the pasture cannot touch, helping cycle moisture and nutrients back through the land in ways shallow-rooted forage never could. And there is another benefit modern farming can no longer afford to ignore. These woody perennials store carbon in their trunks, branches, and roots over many years, quietly building long-term value into the landscape. At the same time, because their leaves are often more digestible than dry, poor-quality forage, they can support a cleaner, more efficient feeding system overall. This is why silvopasture deserves to be seen as more than a trend. It is a practical return to a farming model that supports animal welfare, soil health, and long-term resilience at the same time. In other words, it is not just a better way to feed livestock, it is a better way to farm. Part 7. Building your own zero replanting fodder bank. So the next question is the one that matters most. How do you actually bring this onto your own land without turning your whole farm upside down? Do you need to tear out every pasture, plant wall-to-wall fodder trees, and completely rebuild the place from scratch? Not at all. In fact, the smartest approach is usually much simpler than people expect. A good place to begin is with what many farmers call the 10% rule. You do not need to convert everything. You take the poorest corner of your property, the sandy strip, the dry slope, the patch that never seems to hold grass the way it should, and you turn that area into a dedicated perennial fodder bank. Instead of fighting that land year after year with the same weak result, you give it a job it is actually suited to do. But this is also the stage where most beginners make their biggest mistakes, so pay very close attention here. In the first year, and sometimes longer, these plants are nowhere near as tough as they look once mature. They are vulnerable. They do not like competition, especially from weeds stealing moisture and light. That is why you need to keep a clean zone around young plants and give them the best chance to establish without stress. And just as important, you must keep livestock off them long enough to let roots and structure develop properly. If animals get in too early, they will not politely sample the leaves. They will pull, tear, trample, and in many cases destroy the planting before it ever has a chance to become useful. Once the plants are established, the job changes. At that point, success is all about management. A woody perennial naturally wants to keep growing upward like a tree. But if the best leaves are far above the reach of your animals, then you are losing the real value of the system. So you manage height carefully, usually keeping growth around chest height, so the plant responds by thickening out instead of stretching upward. That gives you a denser, leafier, more accessible wall of feed that animals can actually use. And that is the pattern to remember. Plant once, protect early, manage well, and let time do the heavy lifting. If you get those first steps right, what you are building is not just a feed plot for this season. It is a fodder bank that can keep serving your herd for years to come. Conclusion: resilience over yield. And in the end, that is really what this whole conversation comes down to. For a long time, modern agriculture has pushed the idea that survival depends on more fuel, more fertilizer, more machinery, more inputs, and more pressure to force higher output from land that is already under strain. We were taught to chase yield above everything else, even when that chase was costing us peace of mind, financial stability, and confidence in the future. But systems like perennial fodder remind us that the real strength of a farm is not measured only by what it produces at its peak. It is measured by how well it keeps going when conditions turn against you. It is measured by how much independence you can build into the land. And it is measured by whether your feed system still stands when drought, rising costs, or poor seasons begin knocking other farms off balance. That is why this matters so much. You do not need a massive property to start building a more resilient future. You need the right idea, the right species for your climate, and the willingness to step away from a cycle that keeps demanding more while giving less in return. One good stand of perennial fodder can do more than feed animals. It can change the way you think about security on your land. If you found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up, because that really helps us share practical knowledge with more farmers, growers, and homesteaders looking for a better way forward. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever thought about planting your own living haystack? And what is the biggest challenge you face when feeding animals through drought, winter, or the leanest part of the year? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because every experience shared here helps strengthen the whole Farmyard Care community. Until next time, keep observing, keep adapting, and keep building a farm that grows stronger from the ground up. Thanks for watching Farmyard Care. Part 5, Leucaena, the tropical alfalfa and the miracle bug. Now, if you farm in a tropical or subtropical region, there is one plant you truly need to pay attention to, and that is Leucaena. Many people call it the alfalfa of the tropics, and once you understand what it can do, that name starts to make perfect sense. This small, leafy tree can stay productive for decades from a single planting, which already makes it a remarkable ally for any farmer trying to build a more dependable feed system. But what makes Leucaena so fascinating is that its story is not just about production, it is also about biology. The leaves are exceptionally rich in protein, which is exactly why livestock respond to it so well. Yet the plant also carries its own built-in defense in the form of a natural compound called mimosine. For years, that created a serious problem. Farmers knew the plant had enormous feed value, but if cattle consumed too much without the right adaptation, it could lead to toxicity, poor gains, and visible health issues. And this is where the story takes a turn that feels almost unbelievable. Researchers noticed that in Hawaii, local goats were eating Leucaena freely without the same negative effects. That raised an important question. What was different about those animals? The answer was hidden deep in the rumen. They carried a specific bacteria that could break down the harmful compounds and make the plant safe to use. That bacteria was later identified as Synergistes jonesii, and once researchers understood its role, everything changed. Farmers no longer had to avoid Leucaena out of fear. By introducing this helpful microbe to part of a herd, the protection could spread naturally among animals over time. And once that barrier was removed, Leucaena revealed its full potential as one of the most powerful perennial feed sources available in warm climates. This is why Leucaena matters so much. It reminds us that abundance often comes from understanding nature, not overpowering it. When you work with biology instead of fighting it, a plant that once looked risky can become one of the most valuable tools on the entire farm.